Hi, I'm Molly Barnes. My guest today is Martin Lubner, who's been a big influence on my life and also a number of the younger artists in Los Angeles. I used to see Martin's shows all over La Cienega Boulevard when that was the hot spot. Then I met him again when my husband actually took some painting lessons from him. So he's not only an artist in his own right, but he's also a fantastic teacher. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Martin, before we get started, you and I were talking before the show about critics. Well, do you think critics are important in an artist's career?
They can be very important in a career. We're not talking about whether they're expressing accurate visions, but they can make or break certain painters. We know of situations like that.
For example?
Well, I had a friend who was very distressed by a review she received. And she quit painting, as a matter of fact. Now, one might say that if you're going to paint, you have to say the hell with the critic. But at the same time, they can change one's life in that way. I think most painters I know expect that they distance themselves from critics. I think that they're much more interested in the response of peer groups, of other artists.
If you had to have a critic review your work, living or dead, who would it be?
Arthur Danto.
Oh, he's my friend.
Yes.
I love him. He's and his discipline is not art. You know,
he's a philosopher.
Philosophy.
Yes.
That's absolutely true.
Right.
I'm going to tell him that if you haven't already. I had an artist that I represented in my gallery, and she did really vaginal images in plastic, but she didn't know it. And a very cruel art critic called it screwing around in plastic and shocked her so much she left. She left the field, became a psychiatrist. I've heard about that happening a lot, and I think if people can't take the criticism, maybe the critic will lead them to where they're supposed to be.
Well, I don't know about that. I think that, you know, the history of criticism, we've had negative criticisms of the Cubists, of the Fauvists. As a matter of fact, those terms came about as pejoratives. It didn't stop those painters from working, but what it does is it casts a way for the public to perhaps misinterpret the work itself. I'm just recovering from the flu, so forgive this voice.
But tell me about why the word fauve. Is it mad dog?
Wild beast.
Wild beast. Who used that in a pejorative sense?
I forget the critic that used that term, but because the kind of blatant use of color and the powerful images that were constructed, this particular critic felt that these were wild beasts.
And what about the Cubists? The same thing?
Yes, I think it was possibly even Matisse was the one that spoke of these painters of little cubes. It was not necessarily a complimentary term.
Really? I had no idea. Now, how did you get started? When did you first know you were an artist? And were you living in Los Angeles?
No, I was brought up in the Bronx, and I started drawing quite early when I was a teenager. And I really wanted to be a poet, but I was a lousy poet.
Who were your poet role models? Who did you like?
Oh, my God.
E. Cummings, people?
Well, Stephen Spender at that time. But I was too young to really know anything about anything. And painting took over, became my obsession. And then we moved out here, and I studied painting at UCLA.
Had you studied in New York? Had you known any of the painters at that time?
No, I was too young to be involved with the Cedar Bar group, and I moved out here just prior to that anyway. I moved out during the Second World War, way before your time, my dear.
I was very close to a lot of those artists.
Yeah.
De Kooning was my friend, a good friend. Pollock had died when I got there, but I got to know all of the old-timers, including Kiesler, and who had done the Endless Room for Peggy Guggenheim in her gallery, and Rothko and Guston. Guston's one of your favorite artists, correct?
Well, I think he's a great epic figure in the history of painting, and enormous courage, took great risks, and has really influenced generations and generations from now on.
Now, the funny thing was, when you were an abstract expressionist in New York at that time, you had to paint abstractly, and he gave it up and started painting the Ku Klux Klan members, and also shoes and things in his life that interested him, and people picketed his shows.
Yes, I think only, I think at that first exhibition, it was only de Kooning, and it may have been Bradley Walker Tomlin, I don't recall, who came to him and said, you have to do what you have to do, you know, continue doing this. And he was panned by the art world at that time.
And then by the end, he was resurrected and made a,
it's just
a hero
before he
again.
died.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Wasn't that amazing?
Yes.
Now tell me about what happened when you got here. You started studying here at UCLA?
Yes, I studied here at UCLA. There was a number of wonderful teachers.
Who was there?
Well, there was Clinton Adams.
He was a realist, wasn't he, a realist painter?
Well, he was kind of a romantic realist, yes.
Okay.
A great lithographer. A very tough teacher, and that's, I guess, the best kind. And then there was Gordon Nunes and Jan Stussy and a number of other painters at the time. It was a small department. It's not like it is now. So that there was a kind of a feeling of everyone knowing what your concerns might be and trying to get you to find your own voice.
And how did you start painting, or what kind of painting did you do in the early days, and what did it evolve to?
Well, I was always interested in the perceptual world, except for a short time when I was a
Which means, what does that mean?
Painting objects, painting portraits, painting what you see, what you perceive. Pardon me. Except for a short time when I was a dreadful non-objective painter.
I remember those days. I don't remember your work, but I remember you at Jackie Anhalt's gallery.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember everybody was either painting pop art, where they were painting old tennis shoes. Mm-hmm. Nobody could get a more original subject, or just wearing out abstract expressionism.
Yes, that wasn't when I was doing it, but anyway, I knew that I was not, it was not in me to be a non-objective painter, even though if I had my wish, I would have been a non-objective painter who painted an elegant membrane, a very smooth surface, with the grace of Matisse. But it was not for me.
What's your favorite color?
I have no such thing.
Oh, you do, don't you?
No.
What popped into your head? No?
Can I say this on public television?
Yeah.
Shit brown.
Oh. So what happened then when you, did you have trouble getting your work shown? Most artists have a terribly difficult time.
I was fairly lucky early on. This was in the early 50s. There was a madman named Ernie Ravoff. Do you remember Ernie Ravoff?
Yeah, he was my landlord when I had the gallery on La Cienega.
Yes,
yeah.
and he showed my work. And there were...
he was nuts, but he wrote those wonderful children's books.
Yes, but he had a great passion for painting.
Yeah, yeah.
He could not tolerate anybody who didn't see the worth, the value of painting. As a matter of fact, a woman came into his gallery once and said, oh yes, I know this artist. I used to study with Fernand Léger in the 20s. And Ernie said to her, so what Léger do you have? And she said, what do you mean, what Léger do I have? He said, well, you bought a Léger. He needed a lot of money. You bought something from him. And she said, no, I didn't do that. He kicked her out of the gallery.
Oh, perfect. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. We don't see that so much today. Yes, everybody's politically correct, and that's wonderful. Well, he was difficult, but he wrote those wonderful children's books.
He wrote those children's books, yes. And he had a passion for outsider artists, so to speak.
That's true, but you were not an outsider.
Well, I wasn't an insider either.
But John Decker, he loved John Decker. He loved a couple of schizophrenic artists, you know, who
Yes.
look like they just come out of the mental institution into his place.
Well, at that time, I think there was also more interest in art brew, the art of schizophrenics, and Ernie probably, you know, latched onto that. But anyway, there was an interesting time on La Cienega. There was a Fleischer-Anhalt gallery. David Stewart had a gallery. Esther Robles had a gallery, and Felix Landau. You remember all of those.
Yes, I do.
But so...
Tell me about them, or what gallery, you were with Jackie Anhalt and Mickey Fleischer.
Yes.
What kind of artists did they show?
They showed a...
You kind of guided them, didn't you? You were the
Yes.
Duchamp of their gallery.
Right. Actually, I think Mickey Fleischer was a student of mine. She wanted to study painting. And then we decided painting was really not for her.
Really? And you had the nerve to tell her that, or?
Well, it turned out that she said, I'd like to do something. And I said, why don't you open a gallery? And that's how that came about. And she had a friend that she brought in, Jackie Anhalt. But the artists involved had a wide range. There were, I don't know if you remember Jack Hooper.
Yes.
Sam Amato was in that group. Arnold Mesches, Morton Dimmenstein, my wife Lorraine Lubner. Harry Nadler was in that. So it was an interesting group because it covered a spectrum of concerns. And then that kind of folded, and my wife and I moved to England, where we lived in London for 6 odd years.
And were you painting there all the time?
Yes, I was painting there and exhibiting there.
Where?
There was the first gallery was the Grosvenor Gallery, which was Eric Estrick's gallery on Davy Street. And now he's passed away, and there's an Estrick Museum, which really deals with Italian painting of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Probably the largest collection of Morandi
really?
in England, yes.
Arnold Mesches, you mentioned, he came to New York. I'm living in New York now,
Right.
and he came to New York. He was like the oldest young artist.
That's right.
Because he had the spirit of a young man. He was determined to conquer the world, and he has. It's amazing what
he
he's
has
done.
an amazing show on now at the Skirball. I don't know if you've seen it.
I did see it, yeah.
On the FBI files, a very important exhibition, both for our times as well as for the aesthetics.
And he had a show at Otis Art Institute last
yes,
year.
Yes, a big show. He has more energy than 100 painters.
It was just amazing.
Yes.
It's wonderful. Now, some of the artists that you mentioned did not make it big time. Do you think that's because they didn't live in New York for a while? I feel that artists have to go to New York and pay their dues for a little while.
Well, I know that that's true in terms of, as you say, making it big time. It depends upon what you mean by making it big time. For some painters, making it big time means I have time in my studio to work, and that's all I give a damn about.
Okay, you're right. I find so many artists are careerists today and really want to make make the art magazines, want to make page 6 in the New York Post.
Yes.
So I guess it is where your priorities are.
It's where your priorities are, right.
Let me ask you about some of the artists that you really look up to. Goya is a favorite. Why?
Look, there's a mystery about Goya. He's a great hero of many of us, but he taught a construct, an architecture of moving light and dark through a picture plane, unlike anybody else at the time. And in his Disasters of War, it's like a primer of how students and painters should learn that lesson. At the same time, there's some kind of mystery in his work. There's always a quirk. There's always a surprise.
For example, I mean, where can we look? What would be a painting that would show us that?
I don't know that the title of. There's a wonderful portrait, a dark portrait, and there's a man standing with a hat, with the hat open, the most brilliant red you'll ever see. You don't look at the figure of the gentleman he's painting until later. It comes to you like music comes to you in time.
Really?
And Goya's work comes to you in time. So he has value for a number of us for similar reasons.
What about Lucian Freud? He's another person that you
Yes.
talk about.
Yeah, he's a bloody genius.
Tell us.
You know, Lucian Freud, I think they said about Manet, he's an eye, but oh, what an eye. You know, one could say the same thing about Lucian Freud. You know, it's interesting that he paint being a fascination of all painters, and he uses a certain white paint. It's called Kremnitz white. It's the heaviest lead white you can use. He uses it only on the flesh because it has tracks. The brush marks kind of become drawn marks like ski marks in the snow. And when you look at a Lucian Freud, you're aware of how he has sculpted that figure. And the ethic of it is extraordinary. He doesn't let anything go by. He doesn't generalize anything. The specificity of his vision is right there unfolding. He doesn't hide. There's no hidden anything with him. He's for those painters that are perceptual realist painters, he's like a godfather, I would think.
The paintings that we saw at MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art here, last year, were mostly of his friends.
Yes, friends or acquaintances. And the story is, of course, that, pardon me, he does not pose the figure.
Really?
He says, well, there's the bed or there's the chair. Do what you will. Well, what's interesting is that art being about life and life being about art, by now, anybody that goes into a Lucian Freud room and is going to pose for him, they must know what his poses are like, because there is a similarity, a kind of wonderful quirkiness about the way that they pose.
It looks like crotch shots to me.
Well, you know, he's a naturalist. He says all forms in nature have equal value. I'm not going to hide the genitals. And if you looked at any of the paintings of his garden, every leaf had equal merit.
That's right.
And he treats the genitals, the lips, the nipples, the ears. If you look at the way that he paints an ear, and what's interesting about the way we paint ears, I believe it was a 17th century Italian art historian who said, if you want to see, you want to detect a forgery, look at the way a painter paints an ear, because it's a small form, and they generally do it without thinking, whereas the larger masses, they will try to forge, so to speak. Look at Lucian Freud's ears. They're all different. Look at the toenails. Each one is different. It's the little things that make you realize the ethic of the artist. And he's a great, great painter.
Martin, his grandfather was the famous psychiatrist Freud.
Yes.
Do you think he was influenced by his grandfather?
Aren't we all?
Well, of course. But I remember asking the curator at the show, was he influenced by his grandfather? And the curator dismissed my question and said, oh, no, not at all. He was much more influenced by his peers. And I thought, how could somebody who changed the whole course of our society and looking at sexuality not affect the grandson?
Well, you could ask a question like that, but before you ask that, you would have to say, do you think that Stanley Spencer influenced Lucian Freud more? Because if you look at Stanley Spencer's paintings of his nude wife and himself nude, sometimes people mistakenly would think that's a Lucian Freud painting. So Freud had a number of people coming before him that he built his aesthetic upon. he may certainly have been influenced by his grandfather's feelings about the psyche and human sexuality. But I think painters really are mostly moved by the language of painting and not necessarily the language of psychoanalysis.
You've talked a lot about Max Beckmann. Can you talk about him?
Max Beckmann, probably in the 20th century, if we have to say who are the 5 or 8 great painters, realist painters, expressionist painters, you'd have to say Beckmann is certainly one of them. And at the time, certainly in the United States in the 40s and 50s, he influenced more painters than anybody I can think of.
Why?
Because of this kind of feeling of physicality, the tangibility of a form, a grabbability of something, and the scale of the work, the powerful kind of drama that he managed to incorporate in his work.
The Museum of Modern Art just had an extraordinary retrospective of his work.
Absolutely.
But the businessman is the one I always think of, with the, as you would say, fauve, the green background.
Well, there are so many of him. You know, we had out in Santa Barbara, there was a great collector, God.
I know who it is,
You know,
too. In my mind, this is a senior moment for me, yeah.
Peter, I forget his name. Okay, well, I forgot. And I first saw Beckmann's paintings when an art history teacher of mine made an arrangement for me to go out and see this collection. I arrived in Santa Barbara, and God, I forgot her name. Anyway, this woman was hanging clothes on the line, 3 or 4 little kids running around, and she said, just go in the house and you'll find them, and open the closets. And there were Beckmanns everywhere. I opened a closet, and you'd pull out 5 paintings from the closet. And they were...
Maybe it's just as well we can't remember his name.
That was unbelievable.
Well, I had an experience like that in New York recently. Morton Newman, Hubert Newman, the son, invited me to his house. He has 5 floors in a somewhat run-down condition of, I've never seen so many Picassos.
Yes.
I mean, it was just mind-altering. And they were treated so casually, it was like being at the Barnes Foundation, you know, where the Matisse is sort of like stuck up like like a bulletin board. Tell me about the school.
I just want to say something. There's a wonderful poem by Apollinaire, and I think it ends where he says, when I go to bed at night, I throw my trousers over my Degas. And the image is that the bed and the wall are so close together, he couldn't hang the painting. And it reminded me of the Beckmanns in this particular home.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, yes. Tell you about what I...
Well, you teach. And you told my husband once that you learn from your students.
Yes, I learn a lot more from my students than I'm sure they learn from me.
Oh, no, not at all.
No, for me, and I think possibly for a lot of other painters who teach, in order to creep into the brain of another person, it's like a chess game. Where is their voice? How can you find a means to show them the discovering of their own voice and what their obsession might be? So by talking about the language of painting from the past, somehow you can find all of these different myriad choices for them. And it's a gamble. You have to then think, okay, let's try this, go this way. Let's forget that. Let's try this.
One of the things I noticed, I came to your studio recently, and there were 20 or 30 people working, each doing his or her own thing. And what I was touched by is your kindness. You have a way of cutting through and showing the student what he or she needs to know to keep going, but your kindness really permeated the room.
Isn't there an expression, kind guys finish last? No, you do what you can do, that's all.
In the moment left, I just want to know, what is your, what do you see in your future?
What do I see in my future? Uh, I see trying to compress time,
Yeah.
trying to do as much work as possible in the time allotted to us.
Is it all a fear of death?
Fear of death, yes. Fear of death and an aspect of death that is so silly is what do we do with these bloody paintings that all painters have stored in these warehouses? How do we dump these on the kids? What museums will take them? The practical part of living.
But doesn't being a painter keep you young?
It keeps me sane, and it keeps me obsessed, and it's my life is what it is.
Do you paint every day?
I paint 5 times a week. I teach 2 days, and some of those 2 days I come home and paint after teaching, yes.
I want to thank you. This has been such a real treat for me. I love the idea that we could sit and talk. This is what I always look for. It makes me feel I'm close to God. In closing, art is not for everyone. It never has been, it never will be. But for those of you who love it like we do, we want to turn you on. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Molly Barnes.